Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to be welcoming you to another City Talk on what is in Toronto an absolutely beautiful fall day. Not to make the rest of the country, or in the case of one of our panelists who's in what she was telling me was the rainy climes of southern France. We're just having a beautiful Ontario day, one of those lovely days that you love to have in October. Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. It's covered under a couple of treaties. One is Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabeg nations. And Turtle Island is like all of Canada, has ancestral history and traditions, and a territory that continues to be held by Indigenous people. And in fact, we have unceded territories in Canada, and we often have people on these sessions who are in unceded territories. And part of the challenge for us, I think, is to how do we come to terms with the legacies of exclusion and discrimination that have been perpetuated by a lot of urban city building practice, including the one discipline that these folks all are part of, design. So I'm going to be interested for them to tell us about this, about how are we going to come to terms with that legacy, and also how do we actually correct and amend it for the future. So this is one of those moments, I think, I've been using this hashtag no more excuses. All the pre-existing conditions in cities that were not functioning well, that were languishing, are now made all the more worse by the impacts of COVID. And are we going to be able to sustain and actually emerge from this extraordinary global challenge in ways that make us more equitable, more sustainable, more just, and more livable? And the design profession has a huge, huge role to play. So I'm really thrilled to have these four joining me today to talk about this. Interestingly, I was relating to them in the pre-session here that our first City Talk, when we created City Talk early in the pandemic, late March, early April, the first session we did was on urban design. And it was early, and I don't know whether we'd had much time to really think about what was going to be altered. In fact, I think a lot of us thought this was a sort of temporary hiatus. We were going to be in a bit of a sprint. We were going to get through it, and then we would see what the repercussions were. Now we realize we were in a marathon, or as I said to somebody yesterday, I think it's like a steeplechase. And we're going to be at it for a while. It seems to be the new normal of peaks and valleys. And how is that affecting us as humans, but how's it affecting us as city builders too? And how's it affecting our interactions? And how is it going to affect our public realm and our built environment? So joining me today, I have four folks that were up for having this conversation and who are practitioners, who are working around the world. In some cases, some are working hyper locally. Some of them are working internationally. It's one of the interesting things about design is that it's actually a global discipline, a global practice. And we know that the challenges to Canadian cities aren't unique, that cities around the world are struggling as we are. But we also know that solutions need to be very particular and grounded in community and the particular kind of circumstances that communities have. So I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this or co-sponsoring this with the REIC, which is the national organization that advocates for the role of architecture and the importance of design in contributing to healthy communities. So we're very, very pleased to have them as our co-sponsor, and they have also been involved with us in our Bring Back Main Street campaign, which actually this week just launched its action report. So I'm encouraging people to go to bringbackmainstreet.ca, and you will see there many recommendations about what we need to do to invest in our main streets. And it involves all of us, including the design community. Part of Bring Back Main Street was the holding slide you saw that we put up when the session was just loading, which is all about design solutions. And that was the result of a big call that we did with the REIC to stimulate interest in designers to work with local communities to figure out what kinds of things could be done from a design perspective that would make main streets more accessible, welcoming, vibrant, all the things that we know go into successful neighborhoods. So I encourage you to go to Bring Back Main Street, have a look at the design playbook, have a look at our reports. Next week, we're all about main streets. It's like main streets all the time next week. 4 city talks back to back. So get your cup of tea or your sandwich, or depending on what time zone you're in, perhaps a cocktail, and tune in and listen with us about practical ways that we've been learning as we've been talking to folks across the country about how we can make main streets more vibrant and all the different things that we all each need to do as consumers and as city builders and as advocates and as community leaders. So I'm hoping that you'll all tune in next week. Once you've digested that turkey, you come and you chat with us on City Talk. So Let's talk about architecture, can we? And I'm going to start with our group, and I'm probably going to go to the furthest away, which is Shirley Bloomberg. We don't do long introductions on City Talk. We post them in the chat, so everybody feel free to ask questions specifically of the panel in the chat, and their bios are there, so you'll know that Shirley Bloomberg is with a firm here in Toronto, KPMG, and it's doing, oh, I just said it wrong, KPMB, the fatal mistake that everyone does, I'm sure, Shirley, all the time, is to provide the wrong acronym and confuse you with the national consulting firm. But I know who you work for. And if Shirley, you can talk to us a little bit about what you're observing in your practice, what you've been observing in your own neighborhood. Just give us a couple of minutes just to kind of ground what your perspective is, and then we'll have the broader conversation. So over to you, Shirley. Welcome to City Talk.
Great, thank you, Mary, and I forgive you.
Thank you.
Disease and urban life have been bound together throughout history. And obviously this has had a profound impact on the design of cities. For example, in the mid-19th century in New York, Olmsted designed Central Park to be, quote, the lungs of the city, to provide both pleasure and a significant public health benefit in a time of malaria and cholera. Around the same time, in London and Paris, both cities built modern sewer and sanitation systems in response to cholera. And sometime later, Haussmann renovated and reimagined Paris through a vast public works program that brought light and air to all parts of the city. After the First World War, tuberculosis was a key driver in modernist architecture, integrating form with social purpose to create a curative environment. With coronavirus, we are again at the intersection of urban design and public health. So what have we learned in the past 7 or 8 months? I'm just going to make 4 points. The first, it's not the density of cities, but the unhealthy conditions of poor neighborhoods that facilitate the spread of the virus. And we can no longer evade the obvious and urgent need for affordable housing. Second, the virus has accentuated the importance of a generous public realm in our city. A city that should put people first. It's become obvious that Toronto sidewalks are too narrow for social distancing or for outdoor eating. The parks have been incredibly important, and I've never seen them used in this way. Happily, there's been a great increase in cycling, and the city is following up on building further cycling infrastructure, so that's great. Happily, there's been a decrease in the importance of cars, and it's very clear again that public transit has to be thought about in a lot more detail, more carefully. Third, the virus has revealed the incredibly positive impact on the quality of our natural environment if the use of fossil fuels is dramatically decreased. Let's use this opportunity to advance the elimination of greenhouse gas emissions, which are pushing global warming to alarming levels. And last, with respect to architecture and design, the virus has taught us how crucial it is to design healthy, sustainable buildings with 100% natural ventilation. Our lives depend on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Shirley, very much for that. And some historical perspective, as you suggest, the link between public health and urban design. I often talk about when people want to count cities out, I always try to remind people that these kinds of challenges have confronted cities for millennia, and cities morph and they change and they adjust. And many of us will remember that cholera was a rampant problem in London until a doctor wandered over and had a look and realized it was a local water source that was actually contributing to people getting cholera, getting their water from that pipe, and that led to collective water sanitation and water treatment programs around the world. So in Canada, we've seen that around public health and immunization, all those things. So thank you for that, and important that people be reminded of that and get some perspective. Okay, Daniel, let's talk to you now. This is Daniel Pearl, and Daniel, I think you're coming into us from Montreal, am I right?
Yes, and it looks a bit bizarre. There's a map of the city of Barcelona in 1859 by Celda, exactly addressing what Shirley talked about, the idea of bringing maybe Cité Jardin, a first version. You know, Ebenezer Howard had his version, and this was an idea literally going back to a time when sewers were just coming in within a 5 to 10 year period afterwards. and even Celda's design had changed. And we've been working with the Urban Ecology Agency of Barcelona, both our firm LUF and also at University of Montreal for the last 15 years, on how to really bring back the pedestrian and the respect that they deserve in the city. And I think that that's something that Paris is now looking at, and he's been working in cities all over the world, including here in Montreal. So I just wanted to start off with thanking Shirley for bringing up those issues. For me, I'd say as both a professor and partner in a firm, we have to foster cooperation and leadership. This is a time when there's a void, especially to the south of the border. And I think one of the elements that we've been doing is an experimental practice at LUF through pilot projects, as well as education and co-learning with communities, and particularly listening to the creativity in other disciplines. So we've been pushing interdisciplinary creativity for quite a long time. So I guess that for me, it's the how and the where, because, you know, architecture, urban design is context specific. You know, when people talk about heritage back in the 1980s, I remember it was very stylistic. And when Docomomo started the idea of talking about these kind of sociocultural, socioeconomic part of history, and almost like the definition of genius loci, what makes really something particular of a place, I think we've lost that a lot in this globalization. So I think COVID is a wonderful opportunity to slow down in one sense and revisit our neighborhoods as we all go and walk. And there was a wonderful article recently published in The Guardian by Sir Norman Foster, and really talked about, I'd say, the magic of the city, almost bringing back the sociological perspective from Richard Sennett, the idea that these cities are one of the most greatest humankind creations. And that's based on trust and mutual respect, diversity, and also maybe First Nations think about long-term thinking, that everything has to be thought of for 7 generations and not just for tomorrow morning's budget. So in our particular practice at LUF, I would start off, we're involved in a wonderful project, C40 Reinventing Cities Montreal, a competition a large team of us won about 1.5 years ago. And it was really based on, we can't just have net zero buildings. We need a building to become a leitmotif to change a neighborhood and to work with the neighborhood and co-learn with the neighborhood. And that's something that maybe, as Norman Foster said, this is a chance to speed up those experimental projects that would have happened anyway. A second one is we're working on an innovative social housing project, affordable housing here in Griffintown, downtown Montreal, where for the first time, we're going to be doing an envelope that's designed to handle 72-hour power failures and keep people in their units in the midst of summer, in the midst of winter, in our really crazy climate here in Montreal. A third form of innovation is in, one of the winners with firm La Pointe Magne of Lab École, which is a kind of a new how to experiment with primary schools. And the whole idea that interdisciplinary activity starts in kindergarten in grade 1, where food and sports and culture are entering into the conversation all around the way we design our schools and connect them with the inside and the outside. And with that, we won another competition on the western edge of Montreal with La Pointe Magne for a new City Hall library and aqua center. And I think what most important is the space in the center of that is a public realm in what is normally suburbia. And the idea that public spaces are going to be the key to relaunch so many components of our lives. Maybe to finish the component I do as a researcher with our students, we've been looking at the Lachine Canal in Montreal, its whole industrial heritage, and it's starting to disappear. And I don't think it's a question of fighting it on a kind of simply historical level. I think it's understanding the roots of the industry in Montreal and envisioning a new green infrastructure. So we've been working with students and actually projects on the idea of urban agriculture, industrial ecology, and specifically local circular economy. Can we actually just find a way to support this idea? Because our biggest carbon problem in Montreal and Quebec is in our food and our waste and our transport. It's not actually in our buildings per se, as far as energy's perspective concerned. So really, how can architects facilitate and lead this discovery, rediscovery, is what I think it's allowing us to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm interested in this notion of co-learning with neighborhoods. I want to come back to you and talk with you more about that. I'm just going to remark that, when you have sessions with architects, I guess it must just be part of your way of operating, the vernacular that you have, that you live a lot with your history. That you talk a lot about precedent, and you talk about, so that it could have been a drinking game for me to wait to see how long until one of you said Ebenezer Howard, or I'm waiting for Le Corbusier. I'm waiting for whoever's going to be the first to say that. All right, Sam, let's go to you. Sam, I see two flags behind you. I'm pretty sure you're in Edmonton. I don't think either of those flags are the city of Edmonton. I'm assuming you're going to tell us what two flags are behind you, and welcome to City Talk. And we're keen to hear your perspective, and I hope you're going to tell us what the flags are. We heard what the map was behind Daniel. I want to hear what the flags are behind you.
Interestingly, thank you, Mary. I wasn't expecting you to ask that question, but since you asked it, yes, I'm in Edmonton. Lovely weather, beautiful city, and the flag behind me. I'm actually in the consulate of Botswana in Canada. So that flag there is the flag of the Republic of Botswana, and on the other side, of course, the flag with the maple leaf, right? So
are you the Consul General to Botswana in Canada, and that's in Edmonton?
Yes, it's in Edmonton. Yes.
How fantastic is that?
Yeah. Everything does not have to be in Toronto, which is the center of the universe,
Yes.
that.
Yes, including, thank God, Botswana. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we are the Canadian Urban Institute. We're in the connective tissue business, and so we're determined, as you suggest, to continue to remind people that it's not all about Toronto. So true. So talk to us, Sam. Tell us what you've been observing, both in terms of your own neighborhood in Edmonton, but your practice and your engagement with other places around the world. We're very interested to hear.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I think there is a kind of commonality in a lot of things happening around the world. What we're saying is COVID has actually exposed a lot of fracture and the strength and the resilience that we see, right, within our various community. It kind of reminded me of a whole lot of things. You talked about how architects, look at history and precedents. Maybe without repeating what Shirley had mentioned, Shirley will probably know that way back in South Africa, right, which, we have a common link with, fair architecture is actually a very interesting thing that shapes the way our environment is. The whole, urban design, domestic design, and virtually every kind of design is actually driven by that. So a few examples I'll give. So there is that very strong connection, like Shirley had mentioned, between diseases and how we shape our architecture. One very good example that COVID exposed was the initial level of ignorance, that fear of not knowing anything about the disease that shapes things. Reminded me of during the colonial era in Africa, where malaria was actually one of the diseases that they needed to contend with. So you have these Europeans coming to Africa, knew nothing about malaria, but there were all these conspiracy theories and all these, very wrong assumptions. And one of the funniest one was the whole idea that, wow, okay, putting it in context, in Africa, for instance, you have, a lot of the buildings and residential areas are actually bungalows and, on the ground level, on, that grade. So someone came with a bright idea among the colonial administrators that, if you actually elevate your building and you have your bedrooms on the, on the upper floor, you are going to be free from malaria. And, what happened was just the opposite. And they realized that some of the solutions was cross ventilations and all that. Now, the point is, this is not new. What we're seeing with COVID. What I find very interesting is, interestingly, I was just comparing notes with Muzan Majidi, who is the CEO of Zaha Hadid, that we're currently doing, some very interesting, initiatives with right now. And pre-COVID and post-COVID, we are seeing changes in programs. We're doing a project right now in Punta Cana, a resort project, right? And within that resort project, before COVID, because this started around March or thereabout, with all the requirement was, we need this very close, intimate space, and all that. Fast forward 3 months later, the program is changing. We need large space, we need social distancing. So what's happening in the immediate sense actually, affecting things. It's not any different from what's happening in Edmonton, also. And interestingly, seeing the level of construction, that is going on, and virtually a lot of things, happening. So I think we'll have the opportunity, of talking about this. The concept of less is more is becoming very relevant, right now. The whole idea of, existence minimum, right? That has always been, something that has shaped architecture in history, especially in dwelling, in residential architecture is definitely something about it. And lastly, talking about fair architecture and the impact it has over the urban space. I still remember way back in Nigeria, because I schooled in Nigeria at the Ahmadu Bello University and Ambrose Ali University. During the 80s, a lot of cities were terrorized by armed robbers, right? Hijackers. And as a result of that, people now started violating, the bylaws and the ordinances that require that the fences around your domestic areas shall not exceed 1.2 meters high and all that. And people started erecting high fences, around. And that shaped the architecture of a city like Lagos in Nigeria, which Rem Koolhaas actually did a lot of research work, that you have to actually understand that some of these cities, when you use the Western paradigm, right, in judging how those cities are set up, we are going to get the wrong conclusion. However, if you understand how those cities are really set up within, the chaotic nature based on Western standard, you actually know that there's a system there that actually works and is still driven by fair architecture as much as possible. Thank you, Mary.
Lots that you mentioned there that are so interesting. We have a couple of Nigerian people in the chat, just so you know, Sam. So your home country is loyally following you. And one of the questions I want to ask the group coming back is, to the extent to which the built environment actually shapes our values. I bet you guys are going to say it does, but I want to hear specifically how you understand that, and this whole notion of fear, as you just suggested, that architecture has historically been used to instill fear, I think. So these are not good legacies for you guys to have to take apart. Okay, let's go to you, Ryan. I think you're in Toronto, am I right?
I'm not, I'm in Winnipeg area.
Oh my gosh, see, there you go. I just did what Sam suggested. I just made it only about Toronto. Sorry, I thought you were with a Toronto firm, so I made a wrong conclusion there.
No, you made a correct conclusion. I am with a Toronto firm, but we have an office in Winnipeg and one in Thunder Bay.
Well, I hope that Brooke and Ann forgive me for not acknowledging that. So it's great to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective from Winnipeg, where the mosquitoes are big, but you must be excited now because the mosquitoes are going to be replaced by snow very soon, probably. Right.
Yeah, I guess that's all we're known for.
Not all. Oh no, not all.
I think, listening to the other folks speak, I kind of went to a dark place in terms of disease, and really thought back in terms of historical, how disease has really aided in the colonization of Canada, used intentionally. And also going to connecting disease and architecture, looking at how structures and systems like residential school were really experiments against Indigenous people, and intentionally utilizing disease in that way, grouping people together so that the effects of tuberculosis could be unveiled and studied. And sorry, I went to a dark place, but I couldn't help but bring it.
I think this is part of the legacy that we're dealing with. These are instruments. They can be an instrument of oppression or of liberation, I guess, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think what's really come kind of the COVID has really laid bare personally is, I have two young children. How do we become school teachers at times? How do we teach them about this kind of pandemic disease? How do we respond to their questions about when is this going away? When can I be with my friends and family and all those things? But it's also exposed, our desire to be outside, our desire to connect with the land. We have a little bit more immediate opportunity here in Winnipeg and near Selkirk, where I live. And it's really also created the opportunity for knowledge to be shared. I mean, technology is an amazing tool when used properly, and being able to learn, language, cultural understanding, knowledge keepers are able to share for those who are proficient, with a broader audience, whereas, before we'd have to travel to get to those places. So that's been an incredible opportunity. engagement in general. We've had several opportunities where connecting with clients is, we really have to tune our presentations and our content to ensure that we're reaching the maximum amount of people. And in some cases, mailing out our presentations far in advance so that people who are not online, who are just on the phone, can engage with what we're doing. Seeing in our day-to-day lives, the ghost town that has become our cities, and then, really seeing what are the bare bones activities of our cities, our vulnerable populations who are out there on the streets, and it really exposes, those fractures in our society. So, but, really grateful that the project work continues. There was always that uncertainty that we weren't going to be going forward with some of our projects, or that new projects wouldn't be coming up, but, really grateful for those opportunities. Where it's been reflected in architecture, a lot in mechanical systems. We hear about air quality, really a primary concern, and really, and in outdoor spaces, allowing the amount of circulation and spatial separation that permits this kind of gathering. But I mean, we all hope this is temporary. We're all hoping that this is going to be something of the past, and that we're able to return to a sense of normalcy. So always holding out that hope. But also, travel slowed down for me. I did find myself in Toronto every couple of weeks, which was great for projects, hard on the family, but, looking forward to that in-person engagement again, because seeing that we can do it all online, that's great, but we really don't want to miss out on those personal connections and opportunities, especially with community. And lastly, I'll just say, we are talking about urban, but, these are centers for our remote communities too. And really having those communities in mind when we're thinking about, the creation of space, and trying to figure out, what does the future look like? It really has laid bare for those communities, that there are gaps in healthcare, gaps in housing, things that we already know. So I think the exposure and laying bare all these things has really been eye-opening. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So I want to ask, I just want to encourage people in the chat, direct your comments to panelists and attendees if you can, so that everybody sees them, because there's probably somebody on the chat who will answer your question more quickly than we can get to it. So by all means, post to everybody if you can. I want to ask a question about the role of the designer in how society actually is constructed, because one of the constraints that I worry about is that you folks work for clients. And I'm interested how, we're in 7 months into a global pandemic. I don't have a sense that the architectural profession is leading in providing solutions, at least not visibly, or not in the popular media, you're not. And I'm curious about that. Tell me if I'm wrong. If you think you are, then let me know. But part of my instinct on that is because you wait for your client to give you the mandate to do it, as opposed to actually initiating it yourselves. So Shirley is shaking her head. Talk to me.
Well, I think this is what I'm actually incredibly excited about. Despite all the misery that COVID have brought, architects are incredibly relevant again. I think even pre-COVID, in terms of the extraordinary challenges, inequity, climate change, migration, et cetera, we can actually have a tangible impact on this. We actually have the skills of synthesis, and this is the kind of work that we do to actually have an impact. So I think for the first time in my career, we've never been so relevant. And in our office, a few years ago, we started a KPMB lab, and we've been exploring all these issues of climate change and also social justice projects. We've done affordable housing. We're working on Indigenous housing as well. We're looking to cast a much wider net. And And frankly, the young people in our office are super interested in this because I think everyone really is looking for meaning in their work. And so I would say it's true that we also have to make a living and pay our staff and so on. But what's so interesting is our institutional clients are demanding much more of us now as well, in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of justice and equity, in terms of issues of, climate change, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's actually an incredibly exciting time, and I'm really hoping that the profession will change because it has to.
Other people think I have a view on that. Ryan, what about you? Do you see that happening in your profession?
Good question. I mean, I feel like, a lot of the work we do is with municipalities and institutions. I guess I would like you to, sorry, I had a point and now it's leaving me.
Don't worry, that happens to me all the time, but you're younger than me, so you don't have the age excuse. Here's a question, I guess. Some of you were poking around on this. It's the question of the power relationship, I guess. That the client, if the client is a municipal government, go ahead, Daniel.
I think we're very lucky here in Quebec. We have a massive amount of competitions, very, very active, both pure architecture competitions with engineers and landscape architects. And the C40 competition was quite the experience because we were working with developer Pomelo, builder, working with Evaluate Cambridge, Cogiel. These are not necessarily people who would have started with the understanding that the client, the community, the context, understanding ethnography are the keys to actually unlocking a neighborhood. And I think that there was as much co-learning in our team during the competition as there will be in the real project going forward, working with the community. It took a lot of effort to say that the ground floor should be given back to the city, and that actually is getting the foot traffic. With foot traffic, we can get education and co-learning. With education, we can change our footprint way beyond just the footprint of the building itself.
But can you be instigators, Daniel? That's, I guess, what I'm yearning for. I'm yearning for strong voice.
Well, we need to be invited to play that role.
Yeah, I'm yearning to hear your voices championing with communities how design can make for a better outcome. And I'm wondering what it's going to take. Sam, what do you think?
Well, I think it's happening on different layers, Mary.
Okay.
So we can talk on the micro level, which is at the various firms, right? That's one aspect. But there's also the macro and the global perspective. Depending on where you are, there are actually various architectural organizations, various architectural firms, that are actually at the forefront. I'll give you an example. Having been fortunate, we're partnering with a firm called Small in London, 6 Miles Across London Limited. And we got invitation by the Ugandan government to actually, look at a few things that is related, to the interface of, architecture, the built environment, and technology. The whole idea of autonomous vehicles, the whole idea, historically, sometimes if you're not involved with those kind of initiatives, you actually don't realize that architects are actually behind the scene, bringing up, these ideas and creating all this integration and coordination. That's on one level. There's also the other level where, fortunately, I sit on the board of the AIA International Region, and I'm a representative, to the AIA College of Fellows. With what the American Institute of Architects is doing, it's actually something that is very delightful to actually see that we have an organization that hold authorities to account, right? Making sure that, every day, on the Capitol, there's a representative from the AIA saying, these are some of the things that needs to happen. The whole idea of, making sure that the sustainable development goals, right, you're actually, addressed. We also have, for the first time, right, in the history of profession, as far as I know, even though I'm still relatively young in the profession, there's a strong synergy between UNESCO, UN Habitat, and the architectural profession, especially with what people like Tom Vernier, who is the president of the International Union of Architects, is doing. We now have this whole idea of design cities, which UNESCO is sponsoring. So if you're hosting the International Union of Architects, right, the whole idea of, city of the year, design city of the year, right? This year was going to be Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro was going to be the design city of the year, where you actually bring attention to a whole lot of things that was happening. These are all initiatives, that were driven by architects in different places. I can go on and on, but the whole thing about being instigators, absolutely, as architects, most times we operate behind the scene, rather than being, at the forefront. But make no mistake, we are also encouraging a lot of architects. At the macro level, I see it as a zipper kind of strategy. When you zip things, every layer, right, matters.
Yep.
So at the macro level, at the micro level, they're all very important. And I think, yeah, that's.
Well, and I'm hearing Shirley say that within her client relationships, within her projects, she can bring in a whole other set of considerations. You folks do have opportunities to influence decisions that your clients are taking. I understand that. What I'm wrestling with a little bit is it's a heavily credentialed profession. And one of the things that we're seeing is this call for more equitable engagement, and that neighborhoods that have not had public investment and have not been afforded beautiful, striking buildings, your beautiful, striking buildings, with the exception of public libraries, where I think your profession has suddenly emerged as being a contributor to a common, beautiful element that everyone has access to. But that's what I'm wrestling with, is how do you do the interface with community? So Ryan, has the thought come back into your head that you were going to make?
Well, maybe it's another thought,
Sure.
but, in all our work, the idea of advocating for Indigenous voice within projects, we see a lot of RFPs come out that have the requirement for Indigenous content, or and there's a full range within there. There's from this needs to reflect some Indigenous motifs, to we need a full Indigenous architect engaged in these projects. So what that this is all post TRC type of wording, where institutions and communities are making commitments to reconciliation and inclusivity. And there's just such a diverse requirements within these calls. For me on a day-to-day level, and understanding Indigenous histories and culture, really it's about having meaningful engagement with communities, and preferencing Indigenous voice in these conversations in a meaningful way, where it's, without tokenism. And, in some cases, people don't know what they're asking when they're saying, indigenize me.
Right.
And I heard this from a friend of mine who said, an elder said, and this is a very stark statement, saying, if you want me to indigenize you, I'll have to take your children. And, that stops everyone, just like think about what you're asking. And really it's about relationship building, right? It's not just saying, sprinkle this requirement here and there. So, seeing, but, it's exciting to see, really close collaborations with Indigenous artists, with Indigenous architects and designers, and this process of relationship building to help create more inclusive environments, to have places that are more reflective of original peoples, languages, culture, that this place has a history that's far beyond any of us, in terms of the longevity and the relationships and the interconnections, and incredible knowledge embedded in this land that we, that all Canadians should be able to engage with in a positive way. And I guess, yeah, that's kind of really, really where I see my practice going in terms of advocating for this inclusivity. And, we're seeing these things laid bare with, during this pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, Black and Indigenous people of color, these issues being raised, and the things that are coming up. So there's there's been an incredible momentum of agency, or at least the feel that we need to be better agents for ourselves and advocates. So, it's an exciting time and a very turbulent time. But
Yeah,
what time isn't?
It's both. Yeah, I get it. At what time? Yeah, exactly. Wait 15 minutes. It'll be the other way. So in terms of this idea of working from the ground up, I'm a ground up urbanist. I'm all about investing in the local. Can any of you just venture from your perspectives as designers, what you see the potential to be for design to actually impact neighborhoods, as opposed to iconic buildings that tend to be in other sites? Thoughts on how yes, Daniel, on how the practice could actually, how you could bring to bear. You mentioned pilots, Daniel. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I also think it's the notion of architecture and architects going beyond architecture into green infrastructure.
Okay.
I mean, if you don't have the bicycle paths, if you don't have the urban ag, if you don't have the community involvement and the buy-in from the ground roots, there's one amazing story. Salvador Rueda, working in De Gracia in Barcelona, tried to get rid of, in a neighborhood, the car, and the people were fighting it. So he set up 50 community meetings, roundtable meetings over 2 years. And in those meetings, everybody talked about the need for deliveries because their complexity, all their ground floor activity is really the heart of that neighborhood, the artists and the artisans. And so they worked out how to get all the deliveries without using trucks. But in that 50-week process, they actually became friends. They had the battles and they built a spirit. I went to visit the neighborhood within a year and a half later on a Saturday morning to see a space with no cars. But instead, what I found was 300 people doing ballroom dancing on a Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. And the ballroom dancing didn't come from the zoning change. No. It came from the building of a community from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And the architects have to actually get involved. So we look at ways our practice, our students, everybody realizes the magic is in the emotive component, because everybody's going to turn around saying, well, I have to walk an extra 5 or 10 minutes to get my car. I mean, there's always going to be that thing. You have to see the other side. You have to see the magic.
So what do people think about how you could democratize the process of design? Catherine Soplet, who has put in something about Penciler, which is a pilot program that CMHC was initiating that actually COI facilitated with the city of Mississauga to start to have a conversation about how people could start to use visualization technology and work, that community people could work alongside professional designers. Shirley, I'm interested in your practice. Have you guys tried that? And is there some way to break the barrier down and to create these relationships that Ryan and Sam have been advocating for?
We haven't tried something as direct as that, but I'm a huge believer in working with community. And I was doing some affordable housing for TCHC, which is now almost all built. And at the time, they had a policy that affordable rental apartments could not have balconies. It was an operational problem, was an eyesore, blah, blah, blah. So in a public meeting with all the residents, I brought the issue up. There was, let's say, a vigorous exchange, would be putting it mildly. Yeah. Turns out they'd been requesting balconies for 3 years through the whole consultation process that they'd had. By the end of the meeting, we had balconies. And so now TCHC does balconies on their apartment buildings. So I think that's crucial, that kind of involvement from the community. Jane Jacobs had a great saying that I love: cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, and only because and only when they're created by everybody. So my partner Bruce Kobar and I had an extraordinary experience recently when we competed in the competition to design the new art gallery of Nova Scotia in Halifax. Mm-hmm. And what we did is we teamed up with an architect there, Oboh, who used to work with us and has a practice there, a young architect. And we created a very different kind of a team and a different way of working than we have ever done. So as Ryan had mentioned, the Mi'kmaq people go back 13,000 years. And it's very important to be building from the ground up. We used that phrase a lot and tapped into the deep history of that region. And we On our team, we invited a wonderful elder, Lorraine Whitman, and also Jordan Bennett, who's both an artist and Midma. And we also had fantastic consultants, a wonderful landscape architect, and we basically co-created the concept. We'd never done anything like that before. And it wasn't easy. There were certainly stumbling blocks, but it was so extraordinary. And where we landed up, we would not have created a building like that had we done it the way we usually work. So I think for us, that was an extraordinary kind of experience to see how we could look at doing things differently in a much more inclusive way.
Interesting whether that will transform your practice, Shirley, beyond just this one project. You know, could you all as professional architects insist on these
I think so.
processes going forward, right? So that any piece of work you take on now has to have as a minimum these kinds of engagements. Sam, any thoughts on that in terms of your experience?
Oh yeah, I mean, you'll probably notice that since the death of George Floyd, there's this whole thing about inclusivity as if it were never there, right? Before, and now there's that conscious awareness, right? From clients, asking for that tokenism of inclusivity. Now, one of the things to actually put at the back of everyone's mind is when you look at cities like Detroit, for instance, right? That got affected with the exit of the automobile industry and a few things that were happening at that time. It took the ingenuity of a few Black architects, for instance, who are most disproportionately affected, right? To create non-standard kind of practices. So practices where you have social workers, right, as part of the design team. So the whole consultation that, Shirley was talking about earlier takes a different turn, because you have people, as architects, we should see ourselves as interpreters, right? We interpret things. We're not gone are the days where, you actually impose, right? This is what you think is right. The whole idea of, you talk about democratization, which is kind of very interesting concept that, that is debatable, but that engagement, that inclusivity has to happen at different layers. There are a lot of things that is happening in the industry right now that is actually quite encouraging, right? That there's that awareness, but we don't stop at that awareness, because the people that most likely need the services of architects the most are the people that don't necessarily have the means to afford, that kind of thing. And this is where the public agencies actually come in. I mean, something as basic as a balcony, for instance, if you have to have, a session, Shirley, to have that, for a very large organization like TCA, that tells you where that problem is. So being able to actually break down the barriers, right? Being able to break down the barriers of, some of these issues, right, is something that is really very important, that architects are at the forefront. So it's all about leadership, right? The leadership is also all about achieving value for money, right? When you look at it, at the end of the day, we have to be very accountable. We have to be very prudent. It's about that. It's also about corporate social responsibility. That has always been, a concept, but corporate social responsibility is not about just providing one artwork or one artifact, there, and you say, oh, I've done that. It's about, encouraging the right level of oversight. So for organizations like TCHC or some of those organizations that actually are the big players within the organization, that oversight to say, hey, what is your contribution to the community? Making sure that no one is left out. Is about also setting adequate benchmark, right? When you talk about the whole benchmarks, right? Right now, COVID is an opportunity that has actually given us the opportunity to set new benchmarks, and we're seeing it all around, right, the corner. So I think inclusivity is really very important, but it shouldn't be addressed from that very cosmetic angle that everyone is doing. Ryan talks about, the TRC, which is actually something that happened in South Africa, almost, a decade and a half before it happened in Canada. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually did, it was really quite interesting, how it happened and the kind of revelation that came. and how do you address some of those issues? So those Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendation in terms of breaking the barriers, even though the implementation in South Africa was a little bit slow, but you can see the advancement when you go to a lot of the township. You go to Kaileshia, you go to Soweto right now. I mean, I was in Soweto, last year. It was kind of interesting to see how some of the aspects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been implemented. I mean, one of the, what we'll call the SkyTrain in Vancouver, is there. You actually have the World Cup, one of the, stadium just outskirts, of Soweto, right? So at the end of the day, this inclusivity is going to be something that will keep happening, right? And it's also related to the whole democratization of the profession. You cannot design for people. I always tell our clients when we have sessions with our clients will spend more time in the buildings that we design more than we, the architects. We have, the amount of time we spend on projects is actually limited. So perhaps they actually have something to contribute, right? That we have to listen, to, right?
Perhaps. Perhaps. Okay, well, in the time that's remaining, I'm wondering if we can focus on what you would say would be a kind of doable goal. I'm interested, Sam, your comments about accountability. I worry that we will squander this moment. We have a moment of pause where a whole bunch of profound challenges are being put in front of us and that we have to come to terms with. And I have a very big expectation of your profession that you will be out leading in your design thinkers. You have incredible skills and expertise to offer to us as we navigate this process. And it can go either way, right? We can go to systems that are just as top down and just as hierarchical and just as excluding as we've had for 300 or 400 years, or we can go in a new direction. So if you were to prioritize in your own minds and your own practices, how are you going to practice differently? And how do you want to influence your peers to practice differently? Daniel, can you take a stab at that?
I think showing our commitment to innovation that's related to the context. So sometimes when we're working on affordable housing, we have to be incredibly innovative on prefab in order to bring down the pricing so that we can invest in the landscape, so we can invest in the people being able to control their future, so that the building is built with flexibility from day one so that it can become net zero on some level, but way beyond net zero, how they start become a leader and become a local developer. I think that whole idea of empowerment of the most important clients is maybe our biggest challenge. I think architects, we're facilitators. We're people who bring the dreams to the people and show them the power that they have.
I love that to be true, Daniel. I love this idea of designing for empowerment and the idea that you would actually strategically be saying affordable housing crisis, solution maybe prefab and modular, we're going, and climate and net zero, those are our priorities, and we as designers are going to double down on our efforts to make that happen. That's tremendous. Ryan.
And our students are also trained to graphically communicate to them to give them the skills.
Right, so that everybody buys in. Okay, Ryan, thoughts on what you think we should be doubling down on in the next period of time as we muck through?
Yeah, well, I think that education is key. I'm always speaking from a perspective of bringing more Indigenous people into the design fold. So it's been really thrilling and interesting working with a lot of young Indigenous designers who have come and gone in our practice, and most of them, are women, which is really encouraging. And, particularly here in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba, there are, a dozen or more Indigenous, I believe a dozen, but more Indigenous students who are taking up the practice and really leading the way. There's some really strong voices up and coming, and really glad to see that happen because we need it. Proportionally, there's only 25 Indigenous architects in Canada, and we need to make sure there are ample voices in that advocacy role, in that space shaping role, moving forward.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that this is not a fast process. You know, recovery from this is going to take, it's going to mark our professional lives. People like me at my stage, this is the balance of my work life will be focused on this. And for people earlier in their careers, this is going to have an indelible impact on. So if you're young and you haven't decided what you're going to do, don't think it's too late to get into architecture school. And as Ryan suggests, contribute to what the rebuilding is going to look like. And it's going to look quite different. Shirley, what about you for the next little while? What are you going to be focusing on? What do you want your firm to be focusing on? What do you hope your peers in other firms will focus on?
I think what's great about now is that there has been a profound shift, and I think architects realize they are citizens first, and that while we serve the clients, we actually are beholden to the greater public good first. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a shift in the profession for sure. And I think with the social justice projects, the urgency of providing affordable housing, all the things that we spoke about, the character of our practice is changing. I think our university clients are all over this and looking at all the issues of diversity and inclusion, justice and equity. Well, you need the justice and equity bit before you can get to the diversity and inclusion, but it's what we're doing is with everything that has happened, particularly recently this year, the social upheaval, hopefully for the betterment of society, and COVID, is we're actually examining everything about our firm. We're examining everything and looking at how we can become even more diverse, have more diversity in our leadership. What are the opportunities? How can we contribute to solving some of these problems? So it's, I think I'm very, very optimistic, and I'm very optimistic when I talk to the young people in our office. And I hope, like Ryan has said, because I know the McEwen School in Laurentian also is trying to attract Indigenous students, and I hope more and more Indigenous young people come into the profession, because we really need that.
Mm-hmm. No, I love this idea of some kind of a declaration that might come out of the design profession saying, here's what we're committed to, Shirley. I think if you're going, it sounds like you're doing a significant audit. I wonder if that isn't something we could all be doing, yes, is an equity audit on our own, wherever our purview is. Yes. Could be our household or our business, or are we seriously coming to terms with where we're deficient and what we have to, what corrections we need to be making, some of the suggestions you and Ryan have just been making. All right, last.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, just like a taking stock, right? And then, but then we have to be committed to go further and actually make the corrections and make the changes. And I'm interested about, you know, there was a move called Architecture for Humanity years ago. Could that surface again in a renewed way for you to lead a kind of groundswell of responsiveness to the challenges that COVID is presenting? Sam, last word to you in terms of what you would be focusing on.
Well, I think, you know, the whole idea of a charter, right, is definitely something that we think we have all the ingredients to make sure that it happens. I'm actually looking forward to a profession that will actually stand up to the challenges that we've just mentioned, which, you know, which deals with things, you know, around human rights, you know, the labor laws, the environment, and also things like, you know, anti-corruption and bribery, which is part of the sustainable development goals, right? You know, that you do have there. Bringing it to that macro level, I think, you know, we need to have champions, and we're all champions, right? You know, that will actually steer, you know, the profession in the right direction. So for every opportunity we have with clients, it's a matter of just nudging them in the right direction. Have you considered this? It's as simple as that sometimes, that awareness first. Having that awareness that, you know, inclusivity, justice, and, you know, the whole idea of having something that is equitable, right, you know, for everyone is good for the entire society. Is the, you know, barrier-free, you know, society that you need, where someone that is in a wheelchair is there. I mean, for the first time in Canada, we had a budget that was focused on, you know, gender, right, which is female. Quickly, like previously, we used to clear snow in Edmonton, and focus is given on the cars and where men do. But right now, the focus is actually, where the women and the children and everyone will pass first. You clear that first before you clear the road. Something as simple as that. So I think it's work in progress. I actually believe that, there's hope. This is an opportunity for us to change the dynamics of how our profession is practiced more than ever before.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting moment for all of you as leaders in your profession, and as you suggest, you have enormous potential. You have enormous privilege that we all operate in. We can influence, and we can have all these kinds of potential impacts on communities, and how much of a burden that then places on folks to then be extra conscientious and really focused on how we make these processes more inclusive and more just. So I want to thank you all for doing this with us. And I want to check in with the design profession in 4 months and see how you've advanced this, how you're doing on your internal audits, and how you're doing on bringing your peers along, and how you're doing on transforming the profession, just as each of you suggested. So thanks for joining me, Daniel, Ryan, Sam, and Shirley. Really great to have you as part of City Talk. Encourage everybody to check back later on canurb.org, and you'll see this video will be posted, and some of the questions will be posted and takeaways. And this conversation that never stops. This is only the beginning at #CityTalk. Next week, we're back for Main Street. It's all about Main Street next week, really, we're literally when we're on the ground. Sessions on operational trends and actions for retail recovery on Main Street, small business friendly practices for Main Street, rapid placemaking to bring back Main Street, and then planning and urban design for pandemic recovery, all next week. So here's a phrase that I used to use from Jane Jacobs. She said, a problem in a city is work that still needs doing. So my addition is, let's get busy. Thanks very much for joining us on City Talk, everybody, today. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And thanks to RAIC for sponsoring. Thank you, gang.